Yeah, I usually like to sort of straighten out my pieces to make sure they're in a nice kind of orderly layout. Because you will have to think later on, you may be, you know, texture mapping. Maybe you're going to be doing this in Photoshop, maybe in Substance Painter. So usually these things should be sort of aligned in a nice, clean way. There's still a couple pieces that I need to work on, but at least at this stage, I can start to test out my baking. So I'm going to show you guys the basically the Xnormal way. So as I said, I've already fixed up my pivot points, baked any translation or scaling in the object. So I'm going to save this out, or save my Maya scene. I'm going to unhide my other model, so I'm going to show all. So I'm going to grab, again, you want to isolate, just quickly kind of check things to make sure they're okay. So this is the high poly, this is the low. And I believe I've taken care of all the non-quad or non-triangle mesh. I do have a new tool that I've added under custom. I think I've already mentioned it this morning, called Bad Geo. So you can select n-gons in the mesh. It'll try to find any mesh left behind that is possibly non-quad based. Now for the purposes of testing, what I will often do is simply just go in to mesh and triangulate those selected pieces. It's not an ideal solution, but I think, again, for the speed of this purpose, for the purpose of this demo, I'm just doing it to do it really quickly. But when you show me your turntables and rotations, I would prefer either quads or something more along these lines. And so I will usually save a version pre-triangulation. Or like I said, I would take care of the triangulation by hand or clean it up a better way. But for testing purposes, this is okay. You know, in fact, I'll show you what's going to happen actually if I don't fix that issue for Xnormal. So I'm going to go File, Export Selection. I'll leave it in this folder. So I'll say this is the Yashica underscore low poly, I believe, so LP. And we want to export it as an OBJ. So I'll export that selection. And the high poly as well. So I'll go to File, Export Selection, Yashica underscore HP for high poly. Okay. So if I go over to Xnormal or load Xnormal, so like I said, the basic way this works is that you have to go into your high poly mesh and low poly mesh. I'm just going to clear up my old meshes here. So you right click and go to add mesh. So I'm going to add the high poly in the high definition meshes. Under low definition meshes, right click, add mesh, low poly. If I go to tools, next, this is my second or I guess third step, I will go to the ray distance calculator. So like I said, it's sort of calculating, or we'll try to calculate the distance between the two objects. You may get stuck at analyzing the mesh. That is very likely, like I said, if you have mesh that is more than 4 polys or more than 4 edges on a polygon, or is more than a quad, it will basically not proceed beyond this. So usually I will cancel. So I'll take my high poly mesh. Again, you can use this bad select geometry tool. Click on n-gons. There's a lot in this one, in particular the text as well can be really difficult. So like I said, as a temporary step, I usually will triangulate those areas just to get this sort of working. So I'm going to triangulate that area on the high poly. Select the low poly, and I'm going to hit Control-1 to isolate it. And again, I'm going to use the n-gon select, and then I'm going to quickly go to Mesh, Triangulate. So I'm going to re-export these, right? These have to be re-exported, and I just use the same names over and over again, right? I should actually rename this the right way. There we go. Yashica low poly. So this is the low. Replace. Unhide. Grab the high. Export selection. So you want to export selection, not export all, right? me just double check that I did that right. Let's export selection. Okay. So now if I go, so what's great about this is that if you're using the same object names and not doing like version 1, version 001, 002, right? Save that for your My scene or your ZBrush scenes, but in this case, it's recalling the same object. So once I hit go, it should start analyzing now, and hopefully it will recalculate. So let me just double check my folder here. Okay. So I'm going to stop one more time. Let me just, again, double check my exports here. So I'm going to export selection. Export low poly. Yes, replace. Grab the high. Export selection. High poly. Okay. I may have to go back. I'm going to close this and try to reload, or I'll say remove. I'm going to re-add. Add mesh, low poly. There we go. So again, I'll go back to tools, go back to ray distance calculator, and now recalculate. In some cases, there may still be errors that are preventing it from calculating. So I'm going to stop it again. Oops, stop it again. And let's take one more look. So I'm going to undo actually this triangulation on both objects. So I'm going to have to isolate each one. Again, let's take a look. Isolate. I'm going to go do a mesh cleanup. You can actually, again, in this case, do a cleanup and then take out these options. Turn on all these options except for the faces with zero map area. I'll do a cleanup. So we'll target the non-quad stuff and triangulate it and clean the mesh. I probably mentioned this before too. You know, models with history as well, exporting from Maya can be a bit of a pain. So let me just take a look. So this thing does have a few edits still in its history. So I'm going to do Alt-Shift-D to delete the history as well. So I'll do export selection. Yashica high poly. Unhide. Go to my low poly. Again, I'll do, let me isolate this for you guys. So Control 1, mesh cleanup. Do the same thing. And let's then go to the delete history, Alt-Shift-D, delete history, and do an export selection. Okay, so I'll head back over here. So this should be loading things just fine. I'll try to ray distance calculate. And it still looks like I said, it's still kind of spinning its wheels. So I'm going to just, again, just in case there's a loading error here, I'm going to just try to reload these. Go back to ray distance calculator. So I can almost tell immediately it's not progressing anywhere in the analysis. So sometimes there are errors, like I said, in mesh, and it's even the mesh cleanup is not necessarily going to catch it. So I will go back one more time, and I want to just double check through selecting. So I'm going to hit 4 so I can kind of see through the mesh, check for any kind of manifold issues, or maybe n-gons, and that seems okay. And let's double check the high poly. So I'll unisolate and then re-isolate just the high non-manifold mesh. Hit 4 so we can see through the model. So yeah, there actually is a problem in the mesh here. So there is a little issue in this object. Okay, so let me hit 5 for a second, and I'm going to try to figure this one out. So again, this may be different and maybe typical of the stuff that you're experiencing. So what I can try to do, if I just hit W, and let's see if I can move this part down. Yeah, I'm not sure if I can fix it. So I'm going to try my sort of simple trick, which is to convert the selection of vertices through Control right click, convert to vertex, and try to do a merge vertices on that. I may have to set the threshold lower because you see it's actually taking out this beveling. So I'll set it to 0.001. And let's see if that works. I'll go back, click on non-manifold. It's still an issue there. So let me just take a look again in this sort of mode here. Yeah, there's some really weird broken mesh inside, it looks like. So I don't want to work on remodeling this. I do want to see if I can find another way around this. One tool or one trick that I use actually is if the mesh is broken, I will actually send it to a third-party software. So that could be Zbrush, could be Blender, could be 3D Max. This has happened, and this is not just a Maya problem. I used to work in 3D Max where sometimes there'd be weird bugs, weird glitches, and I couldn't, the cleaning tools in that software didn't always work. So I'll show you kind of the magic of Zbrush. If I go to import, so you have to go to the tool palette on the right side to import, I'll locate my, in this case I think it's just the high poly. So right away when I try to open this or import, it says mesh contains non-standard polygons, more than 4 sides. Would you like to split these polygons to sets of symmetrical triangles or to a combination of quads and triangles? I think the problem is non-symmetrical, so I'm going to say quads and triangles. Okay. I will drag out the model. I'm going to hit T on my keyboard so I can go into edit mode. And I do want to double check where I believe that problem was. So you want to make sure there's no weird, funky, horrifying polygon display problems. And at this point, this looks okay. By the way, I've noticed this in the lab setup. This setting didn't translate. You may notice your viewport is kind of cut off. You may have to go to Document, New Document, which will fill the space with a full document size. And you want to go to Save as Startup Document. Then you could drag your tool back out, and now you've got the full viewport. Oh, actually, it looks like it's an issue up here. You guys see this broken mesh? So that may be an issue that I would have to go back to Maya and I think investigate a little further. I think there's some bad mesh there, but for the purposes of this assignment or for this demonstration, I'm going to ignore that for now and move on. One thing I do love Zbrush for as well is that if you go in, I've got a little button set up here to check the mesh problems, and it actually will detect other issues, and it's much more elegant than my solution. It's literally 2 buttons. Check mesh, fix mesh. Fix mesh, done. If there's little holes, I can try to hit close holes. Close holes is done, right? So I'm going to export this back out over the high poly mesh. I'm going to reset my tablet or my palette in Zbrush to just a neutral kind of generic object and do another import just to double check the low poly. And this one is clean because I know I cleaned it. If I check the mesh, there's no issues. Now, I'm not going to re-export that because it didn't show any problems. So I'm going to close this up. Let's go back to Xnormal. It should be all listed the same. Let's go and calculate. And now you see it actually calculating a distance between the 2 objects. So again, I tend to let this run for maybe 30-40 seconds. Generally, after 20, 30 seconds, it's usually good enough. So let this run a little bit longer, and then I'll hit stop and copy the results over. Okay, so I'll hit stop and copy results. Basically, it copies them into this location, like I said a bit earlier. Copies them into the low definition mesh. Go to baking options. By default, I think the size in here is set to 512. So usually for testing, I will set it to 2048. Just remember, I do want 4K resolution normal maps. So you will have to set that for your final, but it will be slower to render. The other thing is you do want to set your file location to the right folder. So I'm going to set it to the folder I'm working out of. I want TIFF files. I will only accept TIFFs or Targas, basically. And I prefer TIFFs for normal maps. So I'm going to give this thing a name, so I'll just call it Yashica, I guess. Yashica _LP. What's great about this software is that it will automatically, you can bake out ambient occlusion maps. So I may just turn it on just to show you guys what it looks like. But you can do all kinds of really cool maps, actually, this way. That could be the start of a texture map. Default padding is 16, just like I set up in Maya, so I did that for a reason. So each UV shell kind of gets extra texture that goes out 16 pixels all the way around each UV shell. And so when I generate the map, we should actually start to see that detail coming through now. So it's literally extracting all that detail, including ambient occlusion, right? It's looking at the shadows and shading on the high poly mesh. Like I said, for this assignment, we're not doing ambient occlusion, but I just want to show you that this tool is really, really great for generating these extra maps. So if your mesh is clean, your UVs are clean, you've got a good clean mesh with quads and tris only, you can get a really good result out really, really quickly. And I'll show you how this loads inside of Maya, okay? So this padding, like I said, it takes the UV shell texture that's generating in normals, and if you're doing ambient, it sort of extends it 16 pixels all the way around the borders of those shells. So if I take this model, let's move it aside. Let's just turn off the wireframe display. If I take this one, what I'm going to do with the display on this thing, I usually like to have a blend for these sorts of displays. So I'm going to assign a new blend in this case, a new favorite blend. I tend to make it dark gray. I tend to take the specular color and crank it, and the roll off and crank it. So it's going to be kind of like really glossy, shiny. And then what you want to do is go into bump mapping, click on the checker box, and then select a file. And then you have to go back over to the right side and say use as not a bump map but a tangent space normal. And you're going to click on this little arrow inside the box. Click on your little folder icon. Again, I'm going to paste in my folder location. I should have set up a project, but load your normals. Now, it looks crappy, to be honest. It looks really bad. Partially this is because the color space. To explain this, I guess, as briefly as possible, is that a typical JPEG is 8 bits per channel, which means it's got up to 256 variations of red, green, and blue for a total of 16.7 million possible colors. TIFFs and targas that are 16 bits per channel, so normal maps contain a ton of color information because of those 4 colors and how they blend together. So the way Xnormal or Maya or Zbrush tends to crank them out is 16 bits per channel, giving you a total of 271 possible color variations. So that affects the color space as well. This has to be set to raw. So if your map looks all weirdly dark and broken, it's because the color space in where the image is being loaded is not set up properly. So that's in the file node. Just below where you load the actual image, you have to set it to raw, and you should see it magically appear as this beautiful texture map. Now, like I said, there are some weird issues, I think, because there are some broken normals, right? Some broken mesh on the low res. So these little glitchy areas are still not perfect. And, you know, there's some other triangulation, I think, issues on the high res. It doesn't appear that way in Maya, but this is one thing I wanted to warn you guys about. If you're not keeping your stuff clean on the high res and the low res, if you're not putting in manual quads, you may have to rebuild parts of your high res if you're getting some of these weird issues. Now, is there a way around that issue? Well, yes, you can Photoshop that actually. So you can literally take the normal map in and just like brush it out, basically heal it out with a clone brush, let's say. That might work. One of the other issues is that, you know, my viewports, the texture, like I said, it's only a 2K texture. So if I were to rebake this at 4K, some of those pixelated issues may be resolved. So I could regenerate that. I'll tell it to overwrite the material. But again, this triangulation issue, some of these mesh issues are most likely, if you take a look at how it's sort of skewed here, it's probably because of how the automated triangulation was working here. So you may most likely have to manually create your own either quads or triangles through the methods I've shown you guys in the previous lecture, okay? Now, what's cool about this, though, just to show you as well, if I load, let's say, into the color channel, not that I often do this, but usually, like I said, ambient occlusion can be used as a base texture. So if I load the occlusion map, right, you can see that on top as well. So I'm going to just break that connection, though. break that. There we go. So that's the ambient kind of bake on top. So in a lot of productions that may be used as a basis for the starting of a color texture, but again, that's just a bonus note. We are not doing that for this assignment. It's mainly focused on the normal map. Am I recording? So you see like this little geared dial on the front. You may have to bake some of this stuff separately, or make sure that this shape of that dial completely encompasses or overlaps or touches these little notches. So sometimes I will actually have to say, you know what, this piece, I'm going to have to actually bake a separate individual piece for that. You know, so I may have to isolate that and separate it out and do it on the low res as well. So I'd split off by inverting my selection and then maybe deleting all but that piece and baking it. And then I'd have to stitch this together in Photoshop. The thing is, it's still taking up the same part of the overall UV map, right? So in some cases, some people may have to split off more complex objects if they're not quite baking right. Or, you know, like I said, one thing you can do is maybe take that part of the UV and just heal it with a heal brush or a clone brush maybe inside of Photoshop, okay? So sometimes there's a little bit of work, post work to be done, but ideally you guys can just avoid that. You know, most of the stuff translated fairly well, right? Any little dial pieces seem to have kind of translated over pretty well. You know, the nuts and bolts almost always work fairly well. Okay.